Hi, my name is Jason T. Ingram. I was born and raised in Oregon, and I am a peer, which that term is used by folks in the mental health community to mean somebody living with or coping with, suffering with mental illness, mental disorders, and stuff like that. This is the long version of me talking about men, mental illness, and rural America. And those are three things that, when they're put together, can be a dangerous combination. And the reason why it's so important when it comes to mental health about reaching certain types of at-risk groups is that we're not really good at reaching those that really need help. And the folks that I've noticed when I travel and I've lived around the country is folks in rural areas, especially men. And whenever you leave the city and you leave all the new and progressive ideas and all this latest stuff, you get into places that are a little more traditional. And as we know with men traditionally, we don't always open up about stuff. Now, a little about my background. I was raised in urban, West Coast, educated, progressive culture. In the 1980s and of course the 90s, the era of the sensitive new age guy. So it was very natural for me to share my feelings. My parents were psych majors. My dad was very much into I feel this, and and so that was cool to have that kind of exposure compared to a lot of people, especially in my parents' generation, who they didn't really feel like they were safe to share their emotions. Now, mind you, I wasn't safe to share all my emotions, but still, that was the culture. That was sort of culturally accepted, and it was admirable for a man to share. And we don't find that, and in some ways that's not a good thing, and in some ways that is a good thing too. And the thing that makes it difficult in traditional circles when we're dealing with men, especially in rural America, is that, and this is very extensive, that's why this is the long version, so I'm going to go into a lot of details about a lot of things, and some of this is pretty obvious when it comes to dealing with the average cowboy. For instance, if you see Brokeback Mountain, you got Enos, who hardly talked at all, and it was a great example of a cowboy that had a lot of secrets. It didn't open up very well. And I've met a lot of guys like Enos when I've lived in rural America, lived in the road, and talked to a lot of men about a lot of things. And here is a lot of reasons why rural American men are not only at risk more than a lot of other demographics. Rural American men are also the most unreached group that I can tell, especially based on their needs when it comes to mental health. And mental health has become an institution, it's become a religion, and it's been sort of characterized with certain characteristics that cater towards the female population. So I'm going to go into a lot of different things that there might not necessarily be anything wrong, but when I go into a certain place and I see certain things going on, I'm always asking a lot of different questions. And the questions that I ask, if I was a baby boomer, heterosexual, rural American, Bible-believing Republican, which is a huge demographic, would I feel safe in a particular environment? And that's the question that I've never heard anybody in mental health really ask anything quite like that before, which I'm sure they have, but I've talked to a lot of people a little bit more about my background when it comes to mental health. Now, I have, this was in 2012, I was working with a couple of mental health nonprofit groups, and I did what they call the peer support specialist training, and that was just a handful of days, and it was paid for from a grant for peers to learn how to do peer support and to get jobs doing peer support. And I did get a job doing peer support. I lasted 3 days, so I'm not a great example of somebody who's been recognized by institutions. Now, I was fortunate to have worked for and actually gotten paid for a while, for about a year or two, teaching a class called Peer-to-Peer. And that was coping skills for folks that might have been coming out of a mental hospital and they didn't know a lot of self-care, and they didn't know how to advocate for themselves, and they wanted to do preventative care and things like that. And those were great classes. And I've also seen a trend, and this is kind of a side note too, and I'll get more into this later, especially in urban areas. It seems like every couple of years or so, over the last decade or more, there's more and more men attending support groups and classes and things like that, which is great. It's just when I get out into the country, it's not so much the case. So here I am in the desert in Central Oregon, talking to a lot of people, mostly from a conservative type perspective, and I love hearing their opinions. And I was able to actually connect with some mental health stuff here too. And I've done that also in around Southern Oregon. A couple of years ago, I actually met a psychotherapist who was working in an area that was rural, it was industrialized, it was like a port city. And I was asking, I said, here's my card, please email me, I want to ask you more questions. And I just couldn't engage with this person. And I've noticed that people that are providers in the field, they have people that they listen to. And I've never had a degree in anything, and I can tell sometimes when I'm trying to share my ideas and my experience, which, being an adult for almost 30 years, I've seen some pretty weird shit. And that doesn't qualify me to be heard from educated people, because I have no degree and I hold no position, at least at this point in society, especially when it comes to mental health. I do have a lot to say because of what I've seen, my own experiences, and talking to a lot of people. And I find it interesting that my lack of education, my lack of credentials, gets me heard and considered and acknowledged by people who seem to gravitate more towards folks that they think are more real, or that they have the strength of something, and that, whatever it is, they have a different value system. So to put it quite bluntly, educated progressives have already made up their mind that they're not going to listen to me even before I open my mouth. And I find that rural, especially conservatives, when I identify with them and I find things that I agree with, and I let them know about my background and, not holding any degrees and stuff like that, it's really a trip how many of them are very open-minded, partly because they suffer the same as every other demographic does when it comes to the statistics of those that suffer with mental illness. So, mental illness is no respecter of demographics, no matter what color or gender or orientation or culture, religion, whatever. It's the same as everywhere. You'll find that there are different demographics that experience more trauma, and they will have more needs. And you'll see more statistics of substance abuse when it comes to oppressed peoples. If you want an example, go to the projects, go to a Native American reservation, and then talk to me about mental illness, and you will hear some things and you will see some things. I spent 10 years in Alaska. I traveled around rural areas. Now, rural Alaska is way different than rural lower 48 America. And here's a big thing when it comes to at-risk populations. is when you're in depressed areas, and rural areas are shrinking. A lot of people are moving to urban areas. It's not such a huge deal in America like it is in a lot of other countries. It still is a big deal though. And you'll see industries and of course outsourcing and things like that. When I lived in rural Ohio, was one of the most fucked up places that I've lived, because there was a lot of industry that was being outsourced, especially automotive parts and things like that that were known for parts of Ohio. And the mental health services were so almost non-existent in the little town that I was living in. There wasn't even a support group. You had to drive quite a ways in order to find a support group, and it didn't cater towards the type of demographics that I felt like needed to be reached. So I was suffering, I needed help, I didn't even have my own vehicle, so I started a support group there, and I think I lasted 2 or 3 sessions, and the needs were so overwhelming, and I didn't know much about peer support back then either. I couldn't do it anymore. And that's kind of one of my problems. If I see a need and nobody's doing it and I can't do it and no one's doing it, then I just do it. Which is one of the reasons why, since I've been living on the road on and off for over a year now, staying in a lot of rural areas and seeing a lot of needs, I would love to be able to have the privilege to speak to people as hopefully as a volunteer, and share my background, share my stories, share my ideas about how to reach an at-risk population of people. So, why are men turned off when it comes to mental health, especially rural America? One is pretty obvious. Accessibility is you have to drive far. So that means there's going to be a lot of little offices opening in a lot of different rural areas, and you're going to have these sort of circuit workers that are going to go from town to town, and that's difficult. So it has to be accessible, has to be affordable, and it has to be legitimate. There's a lot of people practicing mental health in rural areas that I don't consider legitimate. I do believe that pastoral counseling can be great for a lot of people. It's helped me over the years, especially when I don't have anywhere else to go, and I trust the church, or I have a good relationship with clergy or a pastor or whatever. It's just that, it's very rare to find somebody like that who has the time, experience, and of course, licensing and credentials. And here's the thing, is that if you go to a surgeon who's a doctor and they cut you open and they put something in or take something out and you survive, that's cool. But let's say you go to somebody and they're affordable and they're not a doctor, and they say, well, it's not really surgery. I'm not really performing surgery. I'm just cutting you open and taking something out and putting something back in, but I'm calling it something else. And that's what I see with mental health, especially when it comes to a lot of different organizations, that if they are in a position where they're hearing somebody's problems and they're advising and they're giving an influence in that person's life, and it resembles mental health care, I think it's mental health care, and I think those folks need to be accountable for that too. On the other hand, you get somebody who feels very safe in church, they feel very safe in a biblical ideology, and you put them in a clinical perspective with a bunch of PhDs, a bunch of urban people, they're not going to feel safe. And so that brings me to another thing too. So I will say, has to be accessible, has to be legitimate, and of course it has to be affordable. They have to be able to have it covered on their insurance, or they have to have a sliding scale, or for people that are not working, because the people that need mental health care the most have no money or very little money. It's got to be affordable. And the other thing too is they have to feel safe. They have to feel affirmed in their political ideology, their religious ideology, no matter what it is. And that's very important, and I don't see that. Now, from somebody who's a granola crunching, tree hugging, cradle liberal, I was lucky to have been introduced to the sort of the Bible influenced culture of the United States for 12 years of my life and beyond, and kind of in and out of that over the years. having an appreciation for it, as much as having an aversion to some of the stuff that goes on, as we all know, and there's a lot of psychological harm that comes with a Bible ideology. It's just that if that is what makes somebody feel safe, that's where we have to meet them at, and that is a huge problem. I was recently at a meeting where there was something that I predicted actually happened. And I felt very proud of myself because I've talked about this a lot. When you get the conventional mental health system from a clinical perspective, from educational institutions, from mainstream government institutions and nonprofit institutions that are, not based in any type of particular faith, they will gravitate towards Eastern thought, which is very offensive to some people. It makes them feel very unsafe when you talk about mindfulness practice because it has its roots in Hinduism and Buddhism. Now, here's the thing. I've spent a lot of time in Western Buddhist meditation type circles and stuff. I found that it was, for me, positive for my mental health care. It's just that if I had been 20 years ago in my life, I would have been feeling very unsafe to be taught things like Qigong and yoga and stuff like that you see in hospitals, in universities, and even government type agencies are adapting these things because there's an urban trend towards Eastern religions over the last 50 years in religious and political circles that geared towards the educated progressive left wing. That's the dominant force when it comes to clinical type stuff, especially with mental health. So what happens when you have somebody who was raised with the Bible, who had a conversion experience that agreed with the Bible in their young years, that rescued them from a harmful life, that enabled them to have a community and a family and a safe place for them to have a belief system that gave them hope, like hope of heaven and a relationship with somebody who loves them. I mean, you can't argue with people of faith when it comes to all the benefits that they have and how important it is to them. And what happens is that the mental health community tries to affirm that. And I've seen efforts made, but the problem is that they don't create an environment like that. I would like to see rural areas. Now, there are Christian mental health clinics, and there's the Menrith Meyer, or whatever it's called, organization that is a very biblical-based and a clinical-based mental health organization that is in line with churches and things like that. And then you get guys like, should I say his name? Dr. James Dobson. Yeah, he's a doctor. And I think that maybe he would be a safe person for somebody, unless they're a sexual minority or something like that. And I think that there needs to be some synergy with both worlds. And I don't see a lot of synergy with that. I don't see both sides affirming each other. And if one side is going to affirm the others, I think it should be the one that is sort of the ruling force when it comes to mental health, when it comes to nonprofits, government agencies, and of course educational institutions. These types of institutions need to cater towards right-wing America, people of faith, especially Bible believers, and men. Now here's the thing, is that when I go into a mental health clinic and I see a bulletin board and it'll say something like, if you get a scam caller, just hang up, like public service announcements or something like that. And then they'll have a thing that's got this rainbow design and it says, this is a safe place for lesbian, gay and bi and transgender and queer people and all that. And I go in there and I say, oh, that makes me feel safe because I could talk about my issues and not be judged. And I actually see rainbow stuff at most, like free clinics and stuff like that too. But here's the thing, is that you get somebody who was raised in an environment where they feel very safe. And when they see a government-based agency, especially one that has a lot of funding, like a sliding scale clinic, and they're putting stuff in their waiting room that makes one group of people feel safe, it might make another group of people feel unsafe, and there needs to be a compromise with that. Or they just need to stay very neutral. Another thing too is that, and this is one of the big things that I want to talk about when it comes to men. For instance, married men, is that a lot of times their wives send them to get therapy, or it's mandatory because of either substance abuse or some acts of violence, or get this, a perceived act of violence, which is very common. And these poor guys who might have a lot of rage, and they might not have even expressed it anywhere close to what their rage is, and they're being punished, and they're being forced into a situation where they're supposed to open up to somebody who oftentimes is not a man, who's somebody who's a PhD, which is intimidating to rural, hardworking people, and even offensive to some people. In fact, they don't even listen to people sometimes if they have a PhD, because they don't feel like they're going to be heard anyways, or they're going to be acknowledged, or they're going to feel intimidated or belittled. And another thing too is that the environment, the wallpaper, the magazines, the art on the wall, the furniture, everything reminds you of a nail salon, of where their wives go to get their hair done and their nails done, and you got a mental health waiting room, and it resembles somewhere that caters towards women, makes women feel safe. Nothing wrong with making women feel safe, because that's a huge importance, because I don't know what it's like to be a woman. I do know that we don't make them feel very safe. And we try to. One of the funny things is that when it comes to making men feel safe, if we make men feel safe, men will make us feel safe, especially men that might be prone to acts of rage and violence. So I would love to see, this is my ultimate rural mental health clinic, is one that's open maybe just a couple days a week, let's say in a town of 500 people. And maybe they're just renting a room in another building or something like that. It doesn't have to look all snazzy and nice. There doesn't need to be a Keurig machine that makes chai lattes and shit like that. It just needs to be a place that's full of guy stuff. And I think that would make it feel better for some people. Now, they don't want to put crosses and Christian symbols up there. Oh, that will make some people feel safe. That'll make some people feel very unsafe, because there is something called the secular right that are really discouraged with the church because they maybe were raised in that area, and they might be moderate drinkers, and they were accused of being alcoholics or whatever, and they don't want to censor their language, but they might still have a lot of biblical influence. So it has to be made comfortable for the secular right as well. Now, here's the thing, is that if we cater towards men in mental health clinics, we will cater towards women as well in rural areas. That's just my opinion. I might be wrong about that, but I think we should focus on the most important, the most at-risk type group that we have right now. And with mental health, one of the most at-risk groups is rural American men, because we don't reach them very well. Another reason is because of access to firearms. This is huge. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of educated progressives don't like me, is because when I hear conservatives ranting and raving about the failed mental health system, and then I talk to educated clinical perspective type people, they have a myth that goes on that thinks that I could just walk into a mental health clinic that's going to be legitimate, affordable, and that actually has room for me, that can actually get help. That rarely happens, especially when I'm in crisis. So, with that being said, the reality is it's hard to find help. You just don't tell a guy get help. Now, there are some people that I think actually need to pretend to have a substance problem to get help, because if you're a substance abuser, it's a lot easier to find help, especially in rural areas. But what happens to a guy who's suffering tremendously every day and he's holding it inside? He's scared that one of these days he's going to lose his fucking mind and he's going to do something really harmful to himself, his family, his workplace, or anywhere else. What happens to that guy? Does he walk into an office and say, I feel like I'm at risk? And that the problem is, here's the thing, mandatory reporters are a good thing, because if somebody confesses that they're putting a child at risk, they really should do something about it, because what if they do something to that child? They're liable for it. What I don't see is people acknowledging that mandatory reporting has a dark side to it. Mandatory reporting makes people feel unsafe. When they are told that there's HIPAA policies, but there's a loophole in HIPAA that says that if you say the wrong thing, or if you say something that gives somebody the impression of this and that, whether you've done a crime or not, then they're going to talk behind your back. They're going to take your power away. They're going to do some things that could actually have a negative effect on you and your family, and that scares people. And they got to find a compromise with that. So what happens is you get some guy and he's scared that he's going to lose control, and he says that. Somebody takes a note. You never know if that person is going to tell somebody else. And that's going to really take his power away. So that's the big thing that people need to do when they're working with men, especially in rural America. You don't take his power away. You give him power. You give him choices. You give him strength. You make him feel safe to share anything that's going on in his life. And if they create an environment like that, that's accessible and affordable, and they don't have to drive an hour every week in order to get it, then we might see a reduction in violent crime. Now, there's urban violent crime, gun violence in urban areas. Yes, we know that. It's just that mental health is more accessible in urban areas, and it's very different. It reaches a different demographic, and we need to cater towards different at-risk people in different environments. And rural America is one of those environments. And when it comes to men and getting them to feel safe, to actually open up and start to heal and start to really know how to get over their trauma and learn about it and take care of themselves, then we will have a reduction in violent crime. And I can't guarantee that, but I believe that. And I believe that when people hyper-focus on the gun issue, they need to really spend a lot of time and a lot of effort in the stuff that I'm talking about. So thank you so much. There's a short version of this here if you want a summary of it, and I appreciate your time.